She sits still, knees drawn to her chest, dust clinging to her lips. There is no scream, not anymore, only breath, shallow and slow, as if her body already knows what comes next. Around her, men murmur prayers, not for her, but for him. The dead man lies on a wooden pyre just a few feet away. His face is peaceful. Hers isn't. Her son isn't here. Her voice is hoarse from calling him. He wasn't told. Or perhaps he was, and they kept him back. A son might resist. A daughter might beg. But a widow, she's expected to accept. The crowd begins to chant. The hole in the ground, already dug, awaits behind her. They say it is an honor. They say it is tradition. They say it must be done. She's dressed in red, the color of celebration, they insist. A mockery or a warning. They lower the body of her husband in first, carefully, gently, as if he is sleeping. Then they come for her. The ropes tighten, not to bind her arms, but to keep her from struggling. She doesn't want to die, but she also doesn't want to shame her family. So she walks forward, one step at a time, into the hole. She isn't the first, and she won't be the last. Across the world and throughout history, the death of a husband didn't just end a marriage. It ended a life. Not his, but hers. From the tombs of Shang China to the flames of Rajasthan, from the rivers of Fiji to the forests of Scandinavia, women were buried, burned, strangled, and broken. Not for crimes, not for beliefs, but for the simple reason that their husbands died first. This is the story of why. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't even named. When the king of the Shang dynasty died, his tomb was prepared with precision, a chamber carved deep into the earth, dozens of side pits arranged like the spokes of a wheel. In each pit, a body. Some were warriors, sacrificed to guard the king in the afterlife. Others were servants, expected to cook and clean for eternity. And some were wives and concubines, given no choice, no voice, no name. This wasn't a crime. It wasn't considered cruelty. It was expected. Burial records from the Shang dynasty reveal a chilling consistency. Death was never solitary. When a nobleman passed, the people closest to him were buried alive or killed shortly after. They were companions not just in life, but in death, willingly or otherwise. In Anyang, the last capital of the Shang, archaeologists uncovered tombs with up to 200 human sacrifices buried alongside their master, rows of bodies. The elite did not travel into the afterlife alone. They brought their entire household with them. There was no public mourning for these women, no funerals, no remembrance. They were not buried because they died. They died because someone else did. In Tomb M1001, believed to belong to a high-ranking noble, dozens of human remains were found without grave goods. Their skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma. Others had been bound. Some, horrifyingly, may have been buried alive, throats intact, but hands clawing at the dirt. Among them, one skeleton stood out. A young woman laid beside the king's coffin, facing inward, her arms curled as if still reaching toward him. She wasn't arranged with dignity. She was placed like an object, like furniture. In Shang belief, death was a continuation, not an end. The king would reign in the afterlife, and he required the same luxuries he had in life: food, drink, music, servants. The women entombed with him weren't honored. They were equipment. This wasn't personal cruelty. It was institutionalized erasure. No records mention their names. No oracle bones speak of their lives. To history, they were instruments, beautiful, silent, and disposable. They weren't buried with jewelry. They were buried with obedience. This was not an isolated practice. It was systematized, repeated across centuries. And while the kings were remembered in stone inscriptions and bronze vessels, the women were remembered only by their skeletons, sometimes posed, sometimes broken. They left no legacy, except the space they filled in the ground. As centuries passed, human sacrifice would fade in China, but the belief that a woman's life ends with her husband's would not die. It would simply evolve into symbols, arches, and rituals that looked more peaceful but were no less lethal. That is where we go next. The sword was no longer needed, the burial pit no longer dug, but the pressure to die remained. By the Ming dynasty, China no longer practiced mass, human sacrifice. The ritual graves of the Shang were replaced by ancestral halls and Confucian ideals. But for widows, the expectation was unchanged. A woman's virtue ended only with her life. If she didn't die when her husband did, she was expected to spend the rest of her days proving she wished she had. At first, it was framed as loyalty, then as chastity, then as honor. By the Qing dynasty, it was law. The state rewarded suicide. When a widow took her own life shortly after her husband's death, her family could petition the government for a testimonial arch called a paifang, a massive stone gate carved with poetry and praise erected in her village. The family received tax exemptions. Sons could gain civil service access. Daughters-in-law gained prestige. But the woman's name, rarely carved. Most arches praised her as chaste widow, virtuous wife, or simply the woman of Mr. Zhang. Over 27,000 such arches were awarded. Not one bore her full name in celebration of her individuality. Death became a career move for her relatives. And if she hesitated, there were other pressures. Whispers in the village, mothers-in-law lamenting the stain of a living widow, local officials urging her to do what is right. She could refuse, but to do so meant shame. Gossip, accusations of promiscuity, questions about whether she had caused her husband's death in the first place. Ethnic Manchu women, originally allowed to remarry, faced growing pressure to conform to Han customs. One edict after another encouraged assimilation, until even among the Qing elite, a second marriage for a widow was considered scandalous. If a widow remarried, her family could lose access to government jobs. If she stayed single, she might live out her days in poverty, childless, discarded. If she died, her death might buy her brother a position, her father a title, her village an arch. Some jumped into rivers, others took poison, some hanged themselves in the family hall where they were once married. Their deaths weren't spontaneous, they were engineered. The state called them martyrs. Society called them saints. But none of them got to write their own stories. Instead, their lives were reduced to footnotes in family genealogies, passed down as cautionary tales. She died for honor. She upheld our name, but never. She wanted to live. This wasn't sacrifice. It was social strategy, a system that made dying the only path to dignity. And while their husbands were honored in temples with incense and offerings, the widows were commemorated with stone arches, monuments to obedience, silence, and surrender. Next, we turn to one of the most celebrated of these virtuous women. A story so revered it was carved in records, cited in textbooks, and retold across generations. But behind the celebration was a woman who may have had no choice at all. We go now to the story of the widow of Huang. She was only 22. Her name has long been lost, but her story lived on. In government records, in family archives, in the praises etched onto stone, they called her the widow of Huang. When her husband died suddenly from fever, the household plunged into mourning. But behind closed doors, mourning turned to murmurs. The Huang family was respected, but not yet elevated. They had land, but no titles, ambition, but no access. And now they had a young, widowed daughter-in-law, too young, too childless, and too beautiful to be left alone. Rumors began. Some whispered that she should remarry, others that she might bring shame if she didn't. Her parents wanted her home. The Huang elders refused. She was still part of their line, they said, bound to the ancestors, bound to the grave. The pressure was quiet at first. Her meals were left at the door. Her steps shadowed. Every visitor reminded her of her duty. It wasn't a decree. It was an atmosphere, a fog of guilt and shame that grew heavier by the day. She tried to resist. She wrote a letter to her own family, asking to return. It never reached them. She begged to stay alive for her husband's memory, to tend his shrine. They said, "The greatest honor is to join him." And so, she agreed. On the 7th day after his death, she lit incense in the family hall. She washed her face and dressed in white. She knelt before the ancestral tablets and drank a cup laced with bitter extract. It burned all the way down. The Huang family submitted the paperwork that same week. They requested a paifang in her name, praising her unyielding virtue. They received tax exemptions. Her brother-in-law was promoted to a provincial clerkship. In the decades that followed, her story became a model in regional texts. Young girls were taught to memorize her tale. Be like the widow of Huang, they were told. Loyal, pure, willing. But none of those retellings mentioned what she wanted. No one recorded her dreams. No one asked whether her death was a choice or a corner she was pushed into. Government gazettes praised her for self-sacrifice. But the truth is, her death was a transaction. Her silence purchased her family's future. Her obedience became a lesson. Her body became a bridge, from woman to virtue, from grief to honor. The widow of Huang may have been real, or she may have been many women, blended into one parable. But whether she lived in a specific village or 1,000, her fate was echoed across dynasties. A life that ended not with freedom, but with duty. Not because she was tired of living, but because others were unwilling to let her live. Her story did not end with her death. It was only just beginning. Because what followed was even more haunting. How the state turned her final breath into stone, and how those stones were used to erase the very women they claimed to honor. That's where we go next, to the arches built in their name, that never spoke their names at all. Stone doesn't weep, but it remembers, selectively. Across the provinces of Imperial China, thousands of arches rose along village roads. Some were tall and ornate, others plain and rigid. All of them marked the same thing, the death of a woman. Not just any death, a widow's death. One that was sanctioned, praised, and turned into propaganda. The paifang was the empire's perfect tool, beautiful, durable, and empty. It didn't need to tell the truth. It only needed to tell the version that served the state. The woman behind the arch was rarely named. She became the virtuous wife, the model widow, a beacon of chastity. Her story was polished until it gleamed, and then chiseled into stone by men who would never ask what really happened. Beneath every arch was a life erased, Some of these women took their own lives willingly, perhaps believing in the values they were taught since childhood. But many were coerced. Some died quietly, others violently, and their suffering was replaced by poetry. Verses praised their modesty. Calligraphy praised their resolve. None asked how much she begged, or if she cried out at the end. What made it worse was what followed. The archers didn't elevate the woman. They elevated the family. Her father-in-law walked taller in the village. Her brothers gained face. Even her sons, if she had any, could speak of her with pride. While living long lives, she was denied. But she became a lesson. She became a warning. Young girls were brought to the arch to admire it, to bow before it. This is what a good woman does, they were told. Die with dignity. Die for your husband. Die so others may live better. The irony was cruel. These monuments, meant to celebrate virtue, were built on silence, and over time, the arches outlived memory. People remembered the structure but forgot the woman. They passed under it on the way to market, painted it during festivals, hung lanterns from it, but no one said her name. No one asked who she was before she became a ghost. The state didn't need her to be remembered as a person, only as a symbol. And so, across the empire, rows of stone stood in tribute to the unnamed. Mothers, daughters, teen brides, second wives, all folded into the same faceless figure of the perfect widow. What's left today are ruins, cracked stone, weathered calligraphy. The arches still stand, but the truth has eroded. Each one is a monument, not just to a woman's death, but to the system that demanded it. They speak of loyalty, but what they really whisper is this: you are worth more to us dead than disobedient. Your name doesn't matter. Your virtue does. With this, we leave China behind, not because its story ends, but because it continues in different forms across the world. Next, we travel to the flames of India, where women did not wait to be buried. They were taught to walk into the fire themselves. The fire crackles. She walks toward it slowly, barefoot, the hem of her sari brushing the dust. Behind her, drums beat in rhythm, not to mourn, but to announce. She is not dead yet, but everyone around her acts like she is. They call it sati. They say it is ancient. They say it is holy. But the story they tell and the truth they hide are not the same. It begins with a myth. The goddess Sati, humiliated by her father's insult toward her husband Shiva, immolated herself in divine rage, a sacrifice of love, a burning protest. From that moment forward, her name was passed down as the ideal wife, so loyal she would rather die than see her husband dishonored. But mythology is not morality, and scripture is not law. In the Rig Veda, the earliest Vedic texts, the act of sati does not exist as a ritual. The verses speak of symbolic mourning, wives lying beside their husbands' bodies, not dying with them, a ritual gesture, not a death sentence. Later scriptures, like the Mahabharata and Puranas, present contradictory views. Some glorify the self-immolation of queens, others warn against it. But what started as metaphor was twisted into mandate. By the medieval period, especially under regional kingdoms and feudal structures, the myth hardened into ritual. Sati became a performance, wrapped in religion, enforced by power. Priests would quote selectively. Patriarchs would invoke honor. Kings would see it as political spectacle. And women, they were told it was destiny. The fire was now waiting, no longer symbolic, but literal. Widows who refused were sometimes dragged, others drugged, some bound with bamboo so their bodies wouldn't leap back as they burned. This wasn't ancient truth. It was social engineering. The ritual borrowed the name of a goddess, but erased the will of women. And it spread, from the Rajput courts to Bengal's villages, from stone carvings to oral chants. Each story told the same thing. She chose to die, but they never showed the parts where she hesitated. The myth of Sati demanded that her voice be replaced with flames, and that's how it became sacred, not through scripture, but through silence. Next, we unravel how this silence served not just religion, but economics, how a widow's death could protect wealth, property, and lineage. Because in many cases, Sati wasn't just about faith, it was about inheritance. A widow in Bengal stares at the funeral pyre. She isn't thinking about gods, she's thinking about land, not hers, his, and how now that he's gone, she stands between it and everyone else who wants it. The fire that consumes her doesn't just burn her body, it clears the way. Because in many parts of India, a living widow was a threat to inheritance, to family honor, to control. Under the Dayabhaga system of Bengal, a widow could legally inherit her husband's estate in the absence of sons, which meant if she stayed alive, she could own land, livestock, and household authority. To many families, that was intolerable. She was young, maybe even childless. Her claim made her powerful. Her survival made her dangerous. So pressure began to build, not always with words. Sometimes it came in silence, averted eyes, meals that never arrived, a shrine placed too close to the pyre, a priest speaking of divine duty, just loud enough for the neighbors to hear. In wealthier households, the stakes were even higher. Land disputes could tie up families for generations. But a clean widow burning, dressed in silk, covered in marigolds, with the priest's approval, resolved everything neatly. One death, one ceremony, no further claims. Even in regions where widow inheritance laws were weaker, a living widow still carried risk. She could remarry, possibly outside the caste. She could bear children with another man, threatening lineage. She could become a liability. The ritual of Sati cloaked these fears in sanctity. It told the village she was dying for love. It told the gods she was loyal. But in truth, she was being removed. And so the system rewarded her death. Families were praised. Festivals were held. Sometimes coins were minted in her name, ironically granting her fame she would never live to see. But there was no reward if she lived. A surviving widow was shunned. She couldn't remarry. She was stripped of color, denied joy, and seen as cursed. She might have to shave her head, live separately, eat from different utensils, sit at the edge of every gathering, as if her very presence was pollution. The message was clear. If you don't die, we'll make sure you wish you had. And that's why the fire kept burning. Not because every widow believed in Sati, but because the system believed in what her death secured. Next, we'll hear from those who witnessed this firsthand, and those who tried to resist. Accounts from British travellers and Indian reformers, stories of widows who said no, and what happened when they did. Because behind every voluntary sacrifice was often a desperate attempt to survive a life that had already been taken from them. The flames hadn't started yet, but they were coming. The widow stood by the pyre, her hands trembling beneath layers of wedding cloth. She wasn't crying. Not yet. Everyone was watching, and no one was listening. When Fanny Parks, a British traveller in colonial India, wrote of witnessing a Sati ceremony, she noted the silence of the crowd, and the noise in her own mind. She described a woman, young and visibly terrified, stepping onto the pyre, not because she wanted to die, but because everyone around her expected it. They called it a choice. But choice implies freedom. What most widows faced was a ritual already in motion, one they had no power to stop. There were methods to keep her from backing out. Some were given opium or bhang, clouding their minds and dulling fear. Others were bound to bamboo poles, legs strapped together to keep them from leaping off the pyre once the heat hit. In some cases, male relatives held her down. If she tried to flee, it was called dishonor. If she changed her mind mid-ceremony, the shame was unbearable, not for her, but for the family. There are recorded instances of widows who tried to run, only to be thrown back onto the fire. One eyewitness wrote of a woman who screamed in pain as flames reached her feet, but was forced to stay, her body beaten with sticks to keep her in place. The priest recited prayers, the crowd chanted, and the woman burned. But not every woman submitted. Some pleaded, some escaped. Some families refused the pressure entirely and paid for it with social exile. Indian reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy documented these cases, showing that far from voluntary, most sati instances were orchestrated, not chosen. He described a widow who begged to live, only for her own relatives to declare her a disgrace. Another was told her husband had left debts and that her death would cleanse his honor. There were also stories of women who survived the fire, rescued or saved at the last moment, only to be driven into poverty, isolation, or forced seclusion for the rest of their lives. And yet, the myth of willing sacrifice endured. It's easier to romanticize a woman stepping into the flames than to confront the uglier truth that many were pushed, drugged, tied, coerced by shame, silence, and the slow weight of tradition. The ritual told the world she died for love, but too often she died because no one let her live. And even after colonial bans, even after reformers' protests, the fire didn't completely die out. Because what changes on paper doesn't always change in practice. That's what we'll see next, how the law tried to stop the flames, and how some communities kept them burning anyway. The year was 1829. The British colonial government in India, under Governor-General Lord William Bentinck, officially banned the practice of sati with Regulation 17, a law passed, a ritual condemned, a death declared illegal. But a tradition built on centuries doesn't disappear with a signature. For many, the ruling was seen not as liberation, but intrusion. Local leaders accused the British of attacking Indian culture. Priests denounced it as colonial arrogance, and some families, quietly, continued to prepare the pyres. In remote villages, word travelled slow. Even slower were the changes in belief. And where belief didn't hold, fear, shame, and honor remained. Sati shifted from a public rite to a secret ceremony, hidden from officials, whispered between families, carried out before dawn, before anyone could intervene. But the colonial ban wasn't purely moral. It was also political. The British saw sati as a symbol of native barbarity, an image that justified their civilizing mission. Their outrage was real, but it was also convenient. It became a tool to promote imperial legitimacy, a way to say, we brought law where there was chaos, civilization where there was fire. In their journals, they wrote of savagery. In their policies, they ignored other forms of gender violence. They banned the burning, but not the systems that made women burn. And even the ban didn't hold forever. More than 150 years later, the flames returned. In 1987, in the village of Deorala, Rajasthan, a young woman named Rup Kanwar, just 18 years old, was burned on her husband's pyre. The reports were conflicting. Some said she walked into the fire willingly. Others said she was pushed. The response was immediate and horrifying. Instead of grief, there was celebration. Locals built a shrine in her name. Political leaders praised her sacrifice. Thousands gathered to chant her virtues. She was no longer Rup. She was a Sati Mata, a goddess reborn. Investigations were launched, charges filed, but the trial ended with no convictions. Not a single person held accountable. The law existed. The ideology did too. In the years following Rup Kanwar's death, her name became both a rallying cry and a warning. Feminist activists protested. Religious conservatives defended. And once again, the debate turned not on what was done to her, but on whether it was a choice. Even today, shrines to Satimatas still exist in parts of India. Women still visit them, ask for blessings, pray for strength. Statues still depict widows in flame as divine figures. And even though no legal sati has been reported since, the symbolic weight remains, because the ritual may be gone, but the expectation of sacrifice never fully left. The next chapter will take us even deeper into fire. Not individual sacrifice, but collective. When widows didn't wait to be burned one by one, they jumped together. Next, Jauhar and the mass immolations of war. The fort gates were barred. The enemy waited below, torches flickering like teeth. Above, in the stone chambers of Chittorgarh, hundreds of women stood dressed in red. Their faces were calm, their fate already decided. This was not sati, this was Jauhar, a different ritual, a different terror, but the same fire. While sati was framed as a widow's devotion, Jauhar was painted as defiance, an act of mass self-immolation carried out by women when their kingdom was about to fall. It wasn't about love, it was about war. The Rajput codes of honor demanded that warriors fight to the death rather than surrender. And if defeat seemed certain, their wives, daughters, and sisters were told to burn before the invaders breached the walls. In 1303, during the first siege of Chittorgarh by Alauddin Khilji, legend says Queen Padmini led over 700 women into the flames. Their husbands rode out in saffron robes to certain death. The women lit the pyre themselves. Later sieges told the same story. 1535, 1568, each time hundreds more. Each time the fire grew larger. Each time history called it bravery. But what choice did they really have? The alternative was capture, forced concubinage, enslavement, a fate not just seen as dishonorable, but worse than death. And so, Jauhar became ritualized warfare, a stage where women played only one role, the flame. Unlike sati, which was often a solitary act, Jauhar was collective. Entire generations extinguished in one night. Pregnant women, little girls, elders who couldn't even walk. It was said that music played as the fires were lit, drums and conch shells to drown the screams. The walls of the fort absorbed the sound, but never forgot it. Later, Rajput poetry glorified these acts. Better to burn in fire than to fall in shame. But rarely did the poems ask how the women felt. Did they want to live? Did they want to fight? Or were they simply given two choices, burn or be branded forever? In some tellings, they walked proudly. In others, they were locked in chambers before the flames were set. And after the fire, the memory was reshaped. Shrines were built, festivals held, even school books taught children to admire the courage of those who chose death. But courage is complicated. Jauha wasn't always a decision made in unity. It was a doctrine of fear passed down through generations, a belief that a woman's purity mattered more than her pulse. And though the sieges ended, the mindset endured. Even today, in parts of Rajasthan, memorial stones still stand near ancient forts, engraved with hands raised in blessing, the hands of women who never got to grow old, never got to be more than a symbol. In modern India, Jauha is not practiced, but it is remembered, with reverence in some places, with horror in others. And in that remembrance lies the danger, because when ritual becomes myth, and myth becomes pride, the pain behind the flames is forgotten. Next, we look at that memory more closely, how even without the fire, the ideology survives. Temples to these women still draw pilgrims, and widows in rural India still face lives shaped by the same belief, that once he dies, her life is no longer her own, the flames are no longer legal, but the silence still burns. In today's India, sati is outlawed, jauha is history. But in many villages, the belief that a woman dies with her husband, if not in body, then in life, still holds power. No one builds pyres, but they do build temples. Across rural Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and parts of Uttar Pradesh, shrines still honor the so-called sati matas, women who were burned alive on their husbands' pyres and later deified. Pilgrims arrive barefoot. They offer bangles, sweets, and prayers. They don't come to mourn. They come to ask for blessings. These women, once silenced in death, are now worshipped in silence. Their stories have been reshaped. No longer victims, they are saints. No longer coerced, they are willing. The past is rebranded as purity. And while no widow is legally forced into fire today, many still suffer symbolic cremation. Widowhood in conservative households is treated like a contagion. She is told to shave her head, to wear only white, to eat alone, to sit behind others at ceremonies, to never attend weddings, to avoid mirrors, to disappear. Some are sent away to widow colonies, like in Vrindavan and Varanasi, where thousands of women live in quiet abandonment. Some have families who will not take them back. Others were never asked if they wanted to leave. They are not burned, but they are erased. And though India's laws now protect women's rights to remarry, to own property, to live freely, the reality on the ground is more complicated. In rural areas, remarriage remains taboo. Inheritance disputes push widows out of homes. Women are blamed for their husbands' deaths. Neighbors whisper. Relatives look away. And temples built in the name of long-dead sati women serve as reminders. This is what a good woman does. This is what devotion looks like. This is what earns you a statue. Even in television serials, films, and religious programming, the widow is often cast as the ever-suffering, ever-sacrificing figure. She is not allowed desire. She is not allowed anger. She is not allowed to start again. So while the ritual is gone, the ideology lingers. In the shadows of shrines, in the corners of kitchens, in the expectations whispered into daughters' ears from the time they are young. You belong to him, and if he goes, you go too. If not by flame, then by forgetting. But some women push back. Grassroots organizations have helped rescue and rehabilitate widows from isolation. Legal campaigns have tried to shut down sati temples and prosecute glorification. Survivors have spoken out, some publicly, some only to trusted allies, saying, "I didn't want to die." I wanted to live. I still do. But they're not the ones in statues. They're not the ones schoolchildren memorize. Their stories are still being written, quietly, slowly. And as we leave India behind, the pattern becomes clearer. From fire to stone, from shame to silence, the methods change, but the message remains. His death ends more than a life. It ends her freedom. Now we travel westward, back in time, to Egypt, to pyramids and tombs, where women were not burned, but buried alive, not as wives, but as servants for a dead man's afterlife. The desert wind carried silence. Beneath the scorching sun of Abydos, men carved deep into the earth, preparing a tomb fit for a god, not just for a pharaoh, but for his court. Because in Egypt's first dynasty, the afterlife wasn't imagined as solitude. It was a palace, and no palace was complete without servants, guards, musicians, and women. When King Jer died, around 3000 BCE, his tomb was vast, but it wasn't built for one. In small subsidiary graves surrounding his burial chamber, archaeologists uncovered something chilling. Over 300 human remains. Many were young, most were healthy, and many, disturbingly, were female. They didn't die of illness. They didn't die of age. They were killed, so they could serve in death what they had once served in life. Some were likely attendants, those who dressed, fed, and entertained the king. Others were possibly wives, concubines, or ritual performers. They weren't named in inscriptions. Their graves were simple. They were buried with small offerings, combs, beads, jars of oil, as if still meant to perform their tasks in the beyond. The message was clear. His afterlife would be filled with familiar comforts, and they would make the journey with him, willing or not. This wasn't just one isolated king. Across early royal tombs at Saqqara, Abydos, and other necropolises, archaeologists found consistent patterns. One royal burial, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of smaller graves arranged around it, often buried at the same time. The timing was precise. Many of these sacrificial victims were interred simultaneously, suggesting a ritualized mass killing, not a slow accumulation over years. Some were strangled, others may have been poisoned. In certain cases, skeletal analysis shows signs of blunt force trauma. The ritual was structured, controlled, and behind that structure was a belief that the king's power didn't end with death. It continued, and so must the service of those bound to him. Women were a part of this system, not as rulers, but as extensions of the ruler's legacy. Their value was functional, their fate sealed by someone else's mortality. Inscriptions glorified the king's journey to the afterlife, but none recorded the fear or voices of the women buried beside him. There was no paifang, no sati shrine, no chants of virtue, only silence and the weight of being considered necessary. But over time, this practice faded. In later dynasties, the tombs changed. The king still demanded service in the afterlife, but they found another way, one that didn't require hundreds of real lives. That's where we go next, to the shift from flesh to figurine, when the Ushabti took their place and the living were finally allowed to stay alive. In life, they served without pay. In death, they were expected to keep working. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not rest. It was continuity. The soul, Ka, lived on. It needed shelter, food, music, servants. In the afterlife, as in life, the elite required a staff, and for kings, nobles, and high officials, the tomb became more than a resting place. It became an estate, one stocked with everything needed for eternity, including people. But the human sacrifices of Egypt's first dynasty were short-lived, not in number, but in duration. As the dynasties progressed, the practice faded. The second dynasty saw fewer mass burials. By the time of the Old Kingdom, pharaohs had found a different solution, objects that stood in for people. Enter the ushabti, small figurines, often no more than a hand's length tall, carved from wood, faience, or stone. Some bore inscriptions, others held tiny tools. They weren't toys, they were workers. Each ushabti was a symbolic servant, designed to perform labor in the afterlife on behalf of the deceased. Plowing fields, carrying water, milling grain, tasks once done by living women and men, now transferred to clay and command. The logic was brilliant. Why sacrifice people when you could bury their likeness? Tombs from the Middle Kingdom onward sometimes contained dozens, even hundreds of these figurines. An entire workforce arranged in neat rows, ready to serve. It was ritual economy, a spiritual version of delegation. The wealthy commissioned armies of ushabti. Kings were buried with hundreds. Some even included overseers, figurines whose only job was to manage the other figurines. And yet, not everyone was replaced. Real people still went into the tomb, not in mass graves, but as specialized performers, musicians, or mourners. And often, these were women. In tomb paintings and carvings, women are shown preparing food, playing harps, applying perfume. They sing hymns. They wail at funerals. They attend to the dead, but rarely as individuals. More often, they appear anonymous, repetitive, interchangeable. Even in art, their role was functional. They weren't buried alive, but they were buried in silence, their identities erased beneath layers of ceremonial performance. For the men in power, the afterlife was a bureaucracy, one that needed structure, and every structure needs its workers. Some were carved, some were forgotten, some were both. This shift, from killing to symbolizing, seems like progress, and in many ways, it was. But for the women involved, their fate didn't change much. Whether as bodies or as brushstrokes, they remained part of the machinery of memory, present but peripheral. And while the ushabti replaced the need for sacrifice, they couldn't replace the deeper truth that women were never meant to be remembered as people, only as parts of someone else's eternity. In the next chapter, we'll trace that erasure more directly. We'll look at the nameless women buried in Egypt's most elaborate tombs, forever present but never seen. You walk into the tomb. The walls are covered in stories, carved gods, painted boats, feasts frozen in time. The sidearm man buried here is everywhere. His titles, his triumphs, his face in profile again and again. And near the edge of one wall, you notice her, smaller, kneeling, head bowed, no inscription, no name. She could be a servant, she could be a wife, she could be anyone. That was the point. In ancient Egypt's most lavish tombs, surrounded by wealth and eternity, the women were often left out of history on purpose. Even queens, even consorts, were frequently reduced to symbols, painted into margins, positioned behind thrones, sometimes not shown at all. Most of the women buried in the subsidiary graves around royal tombs, whether in Abydos, Saqqara, or Giza, are archaeologically anonymous. No personal artifacts, no cartouches, no titles of their own. Just bones, arranged, labeled, then filed away in museum reports. Female, aged 18 to 25. Skull intact. Grave goods minimal. Thousands of women buried beside pharaohs. None of them remembered. Their job was to fill a role, not to be remembered for who they were. Sometimes they were listed as his beloved, but never by name. Sometimes they were described as singing women, perfume bearers, palace women, but not as mothers, not as thinkers, not as people with wants or voices. Even the elite, the great royal wives, often disappeared in the text. Some queens are known only because they bore sons. Others are known because their statues were found shattered, deliberately erased by successors or rival dynasties. The forgetting wasn't accidental, it was systemic. In a civilization that worshipped memory, that built its entire religion on being remembered in death, the absence of a name was more than an oversight. It was a sentence. Without a name, the soul was believed to fade, to be lost, to vanish from the afterlife entirely. And so, these women were not only sacrificed in body, they were sacrificed in spirit, not by ritual fire, but by something colder, historical deletion. We praise the pyramids, we marvel at the mummies, we speak of Egypt's golden age, but buried deep inside its grandeur is a hidden graveyard of women denied identity. And it didn't end in Egypt. This pattern, this deliberate erasure of women in death, would echo across cultures, in Viking ships, in Fijian villages, in African rituals, different lands, different gods, but the same truth. His death was the headline. Her death was a footnote. Now we turn north, to the ice and iron of the Viking world, where women were not buried quietly, but in rituals so violent they stunned even the men who recorded them. It was buried beneath a mound of earth for over 1,000 years. When it was unearthed in 1904 near Tønsberg, Norway, the world stared in awe. A ship, perfectly preserved, carved in detail, majestic even in stillness, and inside it, 2 women. This was the Oseberg ship burial, one of the most spectacular Viking graves ever discovered. An oak longship nearly 22 meters long, packed with treasures, silk, tapestries, intricately carved sleds, wagons, animal remains, and tools. It was not a mass grave. It was a statement. And yet, it left behind more questions than answers. Who were the women? One, older, likely in her 70s, possibly a queen or high priestess. The other, younger, about 50, healthy at time of death. Both were laid to rest in elaborate clothing. Their fingernails were clean, their bones intact. They were not buried in haste. This was a ritual of wealth, power, and precision. But the real mystery isn't in what was found. It's in what might have happened before they were placed in the ship. Was one of them a servant? Was she sacrificed to follow her mistress into death? The grave shows no clear signs of violence, but the absence of trauma doesn't confirm consent. In the Viking world, ritual sacrifice at death was not unheard of. Slaves, especially female slaves, were sometimes killed to accompany their masters to the afterlife. And while the Oseberg women were both buried with grandeur, the lack of clear identity for the younger woman raises an unsettling possibility. That one was honored, and the other was offered. No runes name them. No sagas tell their story. Historians speculate endlessly. Was this a Volva, a seeress buried with her assistant, a noblewoman and her servant, 2 queens, 2 prisoners? The truth is locked in bones and guesswork. Even the DNA results from 2021, which confirmed they weren't related, only deepened the silence. Their story remains unsolved, not because there's no evidence, but because the culture that buried them never intended to explain. They weren't documenting a biography. They were sending someone into the next world, fully equipped. And the second woman, if she was meant to serve in life and death, her silence was the price. Unlike Egypt, Viking burial was not about eternity in stillness. It was about motion. The ship carried them toward the afterlife, but the destination may have only belonged to one. The Oseberg mound stood for over 1,000 years, untouched. But even now, with the ship in a museum and the grave catalogued by science, the roles of the two women remain uneven. One possibly a queen, the other never named. Next, we move to a burial that left nothing to the imagination. An eyewitness account so brutal, so vivid, that it stunned medieval readers and still disturbs today. The ritual killing of a slave girl, seen, recorded, and carried out in the name of Valhalla. We follow Ibn Fadlan into the fire. He watched from the riverbank. A scholar, a diplomat, a stranger in a strange land. In 921 CE, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an envoy of the Abbasid Caliphate, was sent to meet the king of the Volga Bulgars. But what he encountered on the journey shocked even him. A Viking funeral unlike anything the Islamic world had ever documented. He wrote down every detail. A chieftain of the Rus's people had died. His body was placed in a ship. His belongings, his sword, his clothes, his food were prepared to join him in the next life. But that wasn't all. A slave girl, young, unnamed, and terrified, was chosen to follow him in death. When Ibn Fadlan asked why she volunteered, the answer was chilling. She said, "I do this willingly. I want to be with my master." But her eyes told a different story. The ritual began with drinking. Days of it. The entire tribe in celebration and mourning. The girl was passed from man to man, each of them sleeping with her, not as a farewell, but as a rite. Then came the angel of death, an older woman cloaked in ritual garments. She was the priestess, executioner, and enforcer. The girl was led to a wooden platform beside the ship. She climbed it with shaking legs. She was given more alcohol, more chants, more touch. They tried to dress it as honor, but the act that followed stripped all illusion. The angel of death handed her a dagger. The girl attempted a ritual cut. Then two men pulled a rope around her neck. The priestess climbed beside her and stabbed her repeatedly in the ribs until she stopped moving. Ibn Fadlan watched it all. He recorded it without embellishment. His words didn't need exaggeration. The violence was naked. She was not his wife, not his queen. She was a slave, chosen not for love, but for status. Her death affirmed his power, even in death. And when she stopped breathing, her body was placed beside the chieftain's. The ship was set aflame. Smoke rose over the river. Ash and silence followed. To the Rus, this was glory. To Ibn Fadlan, it was horror. He described the Viking people as strong, proud, and clean. But of this ritual, he said, "I have never seen people with a more perfect physique, yet they are the filthiest of Allah's creatures." That contradiction, strength and cruelty, honor and violation, defined how many cultures handled widow sacrifice. A woman's death didn't have to be gentle to be called sacred. It only had to be public and irreversible. The slave girl died with no name, no story but the one told by men, and the world moved on. This was no myth, no oral tradition passed down generations. It was witnessed, it was written, it happened, and she was not the only one. In the Viking worldview, death was a journey, but women like her didn't get to choose where the ship sailed. In the next chapter, we look deeper into that belief system, how Norse cosmology shaped sacrifice, and how even in honoring the dead, the lives of women were negotiated, not protected. To die in battle was glory. To die in service, necessary. That was the Viking worldview, a code where courage was currency and the afterlife wasn't rest, it was promotion. In this cosmology, the dead didn't sleep in tombs. They sailed to Valhalla or Folkvanga, depending on the favor of the gods. There, warriors would drink, feast, and fight each day, rising again the next, eternal and honored. But for those left behind, especially women, the rules were different. They weren't judged by the blade. They were judged by how completely they belonged to the men they served. The practice of blot, sacrifice to the gods, was central to Norse ritual. Animals, sometimes humans, were offered to ensure safe voyages, victories, good harvests. In death, the chieftain became sacred, and someone had to accompany him. This belief system provided the structure, but society provided the pressure. For women in Viking culture, their social value was often bound to whose wife they were, whose house they managed, or whose death they honored. If a chieftain died, a woman might be chosen to follow. And to refuse? It wasn't just cowardice. It was blasphemy. It wasn't always about status. It was about keeping order. Her death reaffirmed hierarchy, that even in death, the man's legacy extended beyond the grave, that his home, his lineage, and his afterlife were still fully staffed. This is why the angel of death, the priestess figure described by Ibn Fadlan, was so critical. She wasn't just executing a body, she was executing a belief. The sacrifice had to be orchestrated, ritualized, complete, and the community watched, not with grief, but with reverence. The act became a story, passed down through sagas and memory. Look what she gave. Look how loyal she was. Look how she went to the gods without fear. But these stories rarely asked what she wanted, because in Norse cosmology, sacrifice was never framed as loss. It was an offering, a price paid to maintain balance between worlds. Yet beneath the surface of honor and belief lay something older, more familiar, a truth echoed in other cultures too. Her life was expendable. His death was not allowed to be lonely. And in all this, the women were expected to be brave, beautiful, and silent. Today, the Viking world is romanticized. Longships, runes, gods. But its worldview carried this weight. The idea that sacrifice could be sacred, that obedience was glory, that a woman's final act was to disappear, beautifully. Next, we leave the cold waters and head into the tropics, to islands in the Pacific where loyalty was measured by rope, not fire, where a chief's death meant strangulation for his wives, and where families, sometimes lovingly, offered their daughters to die. The drumbeat stopped. The chief was dead. And across the village, a whisper spread, not of grief, but of obligation. His wives gathered, dressed in ritual cloth. Some wept, others sat still, their eyes fixed on nothing. Each one of them knew what came next. This was loloku, a tradition practiced for generations across parts of pre-colonial Fiji, a system where a man's power didn't end with death, and neither did his control over the women he left behind. When a high-ranking chief died, his wives were expected, sometimes pressured, sometimes coerced, to die with him, not by fire, not by falling on a sword, but by strangulation, a rope, a brother, a smile through tears. That's how it often happened. It was framed as devotion, a way for the wife to show eternal loyalty, to ensure her place beside her husband in the spiritual realm. But underneath the ritual was a web of family politics, social pressure, and inheritance strategy. In some cases, a woman's own relatives offered her to die, not out of cruelty, but as an act of alliance, because in death, she could secure her family land. In death, her sacrifice could earn them honor. In death, she was no longer a liability, but an asset. After the strangulation, performed by a male family member or elder, the body was carefully wrapped and placed beside the chief, sometimes in the same grave. Ritual chants followed. Mourners praised her devotion. And then life moved on. The practice wasn't limited to one or two women. In one documented case, 17 wives were killed after a chief drowned. 17 lives extinguished, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had loved the wrong man, or were simply married to him. British missionaries and colonial officials, horrified by what they witnessed, tried to suppress loloku in the 19th century. Eventually, the practice was banned, but suppression didn't erase memory. For decades afterward, stories persisted of women who resisted and were shunned, of families who offered their daughters even after the law changed, of old men who still whispered, "It was better then." Women were more loyal. Even today, in some parts of Fiji, the word loloku is remembered with reverence by a few and fear by others, because the rope may be gone, but the weight of expectation has not vanished. There are still women who believe that loyalty means erasure, that love means self-sacrifice, that a good woman should follow a man, even when he's no longer there to ask. Next, we move westward, into the African continent, where widowhood doesn't come with a rope or a fire, but with rituals of cleansing, rituals that still happen today and leave scars that don't always show. Her husband is dead, but the mourning has barely begun when the next phase starts. The neighbors gather, the elders whisper, and the widow is told what she must do to cleanse herself, not for her own healing, but to protect the village. This is widow cleansing, a ritual practiced in parts of Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Malawi, and beyond. It's not ancient history. It's still happening. The belief is simple and brutal. A widow carries the spiritual impurity of her husband's death. Until she is cleansed, she's seen as dangerous to her children, to the crops, to the entire community. And so, a ritual is arranged. She is told to sleep with a man, often one selected by the family, sometimes a relative, sometimes a paid cleanser, known for traveling between villages, performing the act. There is no consent in this. There is pressure. There is coercion. There is fear. Some widows are told their children will fall sick if they refuse. Others are threatened with banishment. Some are blamed for their husband's death, treated as bad luck, or even witches. The cleansing is sometimes framed as tradition, other times as healing. But in reality, it is often ritualized rape, carried out in the name of community balance. In regions where HIV/AIDS is prevalent, this practice has turned deadly. Men known to be infected still perform cleansing rites. Condoms are forbidden, believed to interfere with the ritual's power. As a result, widows who are healthy before the ceremony are sometimes left ill, ostracized, and blamed again, this time for bringing disease into the home. It's a cycle of punishment, one that begins with grief and ends in silence. International organizations and local activists have worked for years to end widow cleansing. Some communities have adopted symbolic alternatives, herbal baths, public prayers, or other non-sexual rituals. But in many rural areas, the old practice continues, because to say no is to risk everything. To reject the ritual is to reject the community. And for a widow with children to feed, no land of her own, and no legal protection, there is often no choice at all. In this system, the woman's body becomes a tool for social reassurance. Her trauma becomes a public event, and her healing is never considered. There are women who carry these stories quietly, women who survived the ritual and never spoke of it again, and others who now speak publicly, urgently, warning the next generation. I was not unclean. I was just a woman grieving. And they turn my mourning into something I never agreed to. Next, we stay on the continent, but turn to another belief, one that doesn't just shame the widow. It blames her, where losing a husband becomes proof of guilt, where the community doesn't mourn with her, it accuses her of witchcraft. The day her husband died, the whispers began. She didn't cry loud enough. She wore the wrong clothes. She looked too calm. To the village, it didn't matter that she had been by his side for decades. What mattered was that he died, and she lived. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, this has been enough to mark a widow, not with sympathy, but with suspicion. The line between grief and accusation is thin, and for many widows, it disappears entirely. They call her a witch. They say she poisoned him, or cursed him, or stole his life force to extend her own. In some communities across Ghana, Tanzania, Nigeria, and Malawi, widowhood doesn't just bring mourning. It brings exile, violence, even death. Some are beaten. Others are publicly humiliated, forced to drink water used to bathe their husband's corpse to prove their innocence. Some are dragged to witch camps, isolated compounds where hundreds of accused women live, cut off from their families, their homes, and the world. These accusations often come not from strangers, but from in-laws, neighbors, even sons. Why? Because accusing a widow of witchcraft is a power move. Once labeled a witch, she can be disinherited, her land reclaimed, her home taken, her authority stripped. And when it's done, no one calls it theft. They call it purification. Sometimes it starts with superstition, a dream, a snake in the house, a failed harvest. But more often, it begins with property, the belief that she has outlived her usefulness and must now be removed. And what better way to do it than with fear? The horror isn't just in the violence, it's in how routine it is, how socially accepted, how many people look away, and how many women begin to believe it themselves. They wonder, was it my fault? Should I have done more? Is this what I deserve? In truth, they were just alive, and that was their crime. NGOs and women's rights groups have worked to rescue and reintegrate widows accused of witchcraft. Some have returned home, others never do. The damage isn't just physical, it's spiritual isolation. To be cast out, not just from your family, but from your own story, from wife to widow, from grieving to guilty, from human to curse. In this chapter of widow sacrifice, there are no ropes, no pyres, only words and the weight they carry. Next, we step back and take a wider look. Because whether in Africa, India, China, or the Viking North, these stories repeat. Different rituals, same core. In the next act, we compare them to find out why so many cultures demanded the same thing from widows: silence, obedience, and disappearance. Across thousands of years and countless borders, one pattern keeps surfacing. When a man dies, the woman beside him is expected to follow. In ancient Scythia, Herodotus described how, when a chieftain died, his favorite concubine was strangled, buried with him, and surrounded by horses and servants, so the afterlife would mirror his authority in life. In Thracian society, as reported by historical accounts, a widow's death was turned into a public contest. The wives of a deceased nobleman competed over who was most loyal. The winner earned the honor of being killed and buried with his body. The others were simply sent home. In Bali, ritual widow sacrifice, known as sati in its own local form, persisted long after it disappeared elsewhere. Dutch colonizers documented cases well into the 20th century, where widows leapt into flames or were forced into them, cheered on by crowds chanting for purity. And then there is Evadne in Greek mythology. A noblewoman, she throws herself into her husband's funeral pyre, her death transformed into a literary ideal of conjugal devotion. A story told not for her pain, but for her perfection. It wasn't just about religion. It wasn't just about culture. It was about a global assumption that a woman's value did not extend past the life of the man she was attached to. In some places, her death was a spectacle. In others, a quiet removal, sometimes ritualized, sometimes improvised, but almost always justified by gods, by custom, by law, by shame. And when she didn't die, she was punished in other ways, excluded from inheritance, isolated from society, stripped of color, voice, name. Across all these cultures, the widow was transformed, from wife to burden, from partner to problem, from person to ritual offering. What connects them isn't just the sacrifice. It's the belief that her existence without him required a justification. The method changed, the script didn't. And while each culture told itself it was unique, the echoes between them tell a different story. That widow sacrifice was never an isolated anomaly. It was a global system, engineered, maintained, justified, repeated. Across empires, tribes, kingdoms, and faiths, across snow, desert, jungle, and city, widows met the same fate. The specifics changed. The justification didn't. At the heart of every widow sacrifice was a common engine, a belief system so embedded, so normalized, that it never needed to say the quiet part out loud. Her life doesn't belong to her. Let's pull it apart. 1. Belief in the afterlife's continuity. From Shang China to Viking Scandinavia, it was assumed that death was not the end. It was a continuation, a mirror world, a spiritual court, a battlefield that needed warriors, a kingdom that needed servants. And for the powerful man to remain powerful in that next world, he needed his retinue. Women, often closest to him, became extensions of his identity in life and in death. Their sacrifice wasn't seen as cruelty. It was seen as provisioning. She was not a person. She was a necessary item. 2. Patriarchal control. At its core, widow sacrifice wasn't about belief. It was about control. Control over the body, over the property, over the narrative. A woman who outlived her husband became a legal complication. Could she own land, remarry, bear children with another man? To some societies, that was unacceptable. Better she be burned, buried, shamed, exiled, than left to decide for herself. By dying, she confirmed the lineage. By disappearing, she preserved the inheritance. 3. Social purity and female containment. A widow was also a symbolic threat. She carried death. She reminded others of mortality. She became sexually ambiguous, no longer a maiden, no longer a wife. So rituals evolved to control her, purify her, contain her. Whether through sati, cleansing, or witchcraft trials, her body had to be ritually neutralized. It wasn't about belief in spirits. It was about the fear of female autonomy. Fourth community as enforcer. These acts weren't done in secret. They were often public, celebrated, ritualized. The community didn't just allow them, it demanded them. A woman's refusal to die could bring shame on the whole family. A daughter's resistance could forfeit her family's land. A widow's survival could provoke gossip, punishment, exclusion. She was caught between myth and mechanism, between honoring a man and violating a society. Even when she chose to die, it was often the only choice that was allowed. 5. The lie of honor. In nearly every culture, the sacrifice was reframed as something beautiful, noble, brave. Testimonial arches, funeral poems, paintings of women walking into fire, statuettes of women beside pharaohs, shrines for sati-matas, myths of queens leaping into flame for love. The reality was suffocating, but the memory was dressed in silk. And so, the machinery kept turning. Because who questions a woman who died willingly? These are the common threads, the hidden gears behind the rituals, the truths that history wrapped in poetry. In our final chapter, we ask what remains. Because while the flames may have died and the ropes may have been cut, the ideology that birthed them is still alive. The question is no longer how they died. It's how many widows today are still expected to disappear. The fires have gone out, the ropes have fallen, the tombs are now museum pieces. And yet, the silence remains. We like to believe these were ancient stories, that they belong to other times, other people. But walk into a courtroom, a temple, or a village today, and you will still find widows fighting for existence, not to survive death, but to survive what comes after. Because while the ritual has faded, the ideology has not. In many parts of the world, widows are still denied inheritance, blamed for their husband's death, removed from their home by in-laws, pressured not to remarry, treated as socially contaminated. They are told to shave their heads, wear only white, eat last, live quietly, and never be seen as whole again. Even in places with protective laws, enforcement is patchy. Custom runs deeper than codes. In India, widows still flood cities like Vrindavan, where they live in isolation, chanting hymns for a few coins, forgotten by the families they once held together. In parts of Africa, widows are still subjected to cleansing rituals, denied burial rights for their husbands unless they comply. In rural China, elderly widows still speak of being denied care because they outlived their role. And in the global West, the rituals are less visible, but no less real. There, widows may face financial ruin, social erasure, and a culture that glorifies male loss while expecting women to move on with quiet grace. Across the board, widowhood continues to be framed as a form of failure, a loss not just of a partner, but of identity, security, and voice. We've stopped calling it sacrifice, but the message hasn't changed. You were his. Now he's gone. What are you now? These are the enduring questions, the echoes of a world that never fully believed a woman's life belonged to her. We've walked through centuries of pain. We've heard the stories no one carved in stone. Now we must ask, why were they erased? Who benefited? And what does it say about the societies that still struggle to let women live without a man's shadow?